Is lecture number 13 out of 18. So that means after tonight we have only 5 to go. And the title of the series, of course, is Hubris and Atonement, State of Israel and Jewish People in 72-75. Tonight's 13th lecture is called Oily Friends, Europe and the State of Israel in 1972 to 75. I want to start, as I always do, by thanking Shomri Amuna, as we should, for being our host week after week, and to the Lehmann family, again, for being the series sponsor week after week. Over there, let's jump into this. Zionism began in Europe as a European response to European conditions. Zionism is not an American phenomenon. I'll repeat again. The people who came to this country were very happy with the good old USA. I'm talking about the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. They came here to the Golden Medina. So Zionism is a movement that did not start in the United States. Zionism started in Europe. Theodor Herzl, as you know, was a European intellectual, and it was a response to European conditions. There wasn't that much anti-Semitism in the United States of America, but there was a lot of it in Europe. Specifically, as I think everyone knows, Herzl's creation of the Zionist movement was a response to the recrudescence of anti-Semitism, because what had happened was, for 1,000 years and more, the Jews had no civil rights. Then all of a sudden, in the 1800s, they got civil rights, and they thought that when they get civil rights, that'll be the end of anti-Semitism. And then, lo and behold, right after they got the civil rights, around 1870, all the different countries gave Jews civil rights. Then the modern anti-Semitic popped back like gangbusters. And the Jews were like all those liberal Jews who had believed in the various isms, reformism and liberalism and socialism and all the rest of it. And they thought that this will end the anti-Semitism phenomena. Were, lo and behold, shocked, and therefore they came up with something called Zionism, which also thought that if you do it this way, it'll end anti-Semitism. It's one of those isms, but it's a European phenomenon, okay? Now, the early Zionist leaders spent all their time interacting with European leaders, not with American leaders, not with anybody else. Theodor Herzl was always negotiating with Kaiser Wilhelm and others. Chaim Weizmann is associated with Balfour, isn't he? And that's the Balfour Declaration, which I spoke about last summer. Ben-Gurion, you probably don't know this, Ben-Gurion in the 1920s was a well-known labor leader, and he was in close touch with Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of England, so that after 1929, for example, when you had the famous riots where they killed everybody at Hebron and all that, and the immediate response of the British government at that time in 1929 was to close off Jewish immigration to Palestine, called the Shaw Commission, and this was like a white paper in 1929, not 1939. And Ben-Gurion went to Ben-Gurion, who was a nobody, wasn't known anybody, except he was known in the socialist movement. And he went to England, he met with Ramsay MacDonald at the number 10 Downing Street, and they had a whole bunch of conversations. And then he turned around and he said, we take away the white paper. Actually, then began a period of 5-6 years in which there was massive Jewish immigration, relatively speaking, into Palestine. I'm simply saying Zionism is dealing with Europeans, because the Europeans are the ones in charge of the Middle East. The selling point of Zionism to Europeans, as crafted by Herzl, Weizmann, and the others, was precisely, we all know that many, many Jews will never be compatible with Europe. Let's be honest. This is Theodor Herzl. You know, you're never going to get rid of anti-Semitism because we Jews are weird, and we cause anti-Semitism. That's what Herzl writes. We carry it, as he says, in our suitcase. Okay? Listen, Hasidim, the Europeans will never be compatible with this. You understand? And therefore, in the long run, it's not good. A Hitler will come along. He didn't use those words, but that's what it means. This ain't Austria. You know, they're not Austrians. They're not Germans. They're not Polish either. Therefore, let's create a country where they can go to. This was precisely the selling point of Zionism. My point being, it's a European phenomenon. And second of all, in a more idealistic level, the Zionist argument was, look, to European leaders, look, even a modern, acculturated Jew wants to give his loyalties and best efforts to Jewish causes, not to French or German or Polish or other causes. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not against France. I wish them well. I'm not against Germany. I wish them well. But I'm Jewish. I don't want to have to bury the Jewish side of me and, give my best efforts to something other than that. So why can't we create a Jewish entity, a Jewish state, and then I can go there and give my best things as a Jew openly and freely and honestly? Don't you want a world in which people don't have to lie, they have to live double lives? All that. That's a big argument of Judaism. There should be some country in the world where a Jew can say, look, I'm Jewish. I'm interested in Jewish interests, not in other interests. Like I said before, I don't wish anything wrong to England. I don't even wish anything wrong to Poland. Go your merry way. And I mean it not cynically. Have your life and all the rest. I want mine. Okay? That was a strong argument, they just want to be Jewish. Many Europeans heartily sympathized with this. Makes sense, okay? And Hitler, of course, the rise of Hitler in the 30s demonstrated the cogency of the Zionist thesis of the incompatibility of Europe and European Jews. Unfortunately. So to put it in crude terms, if there would have been a Jewish state in the 30s, we wouldn't have had a Holocaust. Right? Because Hitler just was the personification of the mood in Europe that there's incompatible, we got to get rid of them one way or the other. Now, to be perfectly honest, the communism had already started to demonstrate the cogency of the Zionist analysis 10 years and 15 years before Hitler. Because under the Soviet Union, you can be Jewish, they won't kill you for being Jewish, but you can't be Jewish. Get it? If you express interest in anything Jewish, whether religious or cultural or Zionist or Yiddish, it's anything, because you get arrested and you're dead. You understand? So you're not allowed to express anything along the lines of what I just said before. I just want to be Jewish, I'm interested in Jewish things. Oh no, you're a counter-revolutionary, we send you to Siberia, and all the rest of it. So, I mean, listen, there's a big tragedy of Soviet suppression of any attempt in the aftermath of the Holocaust to wail as Jews. Okay, I mean, look at this. Here's a Vasily Grossman, if you know, he's the greatest Soviet writer, Jewish guy, obviously. And you should read him. He tells it like it really was in the Holocaust. This is his War and Peace, get it? He's another Tolstoy. And he is a War and Peace. It was translated not that long ago, 25, 30 years ago. And it's one of those War and Peace type things, except it's a World War II. And he what do you call it? He was Soviet Union's #1 writer, correspondent in the war, him and Ilya Ehrenberg. And my point is like this: he wrote this massive novel, which is like a War and Peace of that madrega. The Soviet Union would not allow him to publish it. The KGB confiscated his typewriter, the ribbons, the copies of the article, and Suslov, who was the mamzer in charge of all Soviet culture, said, "This is a great." He told him, he said, "This is a great book, but it can only be published in 300 years." Get it? So in other words, why? It had too much Jewish stuff in it. It was anti-German, obviously. It told the story of the Holocaust, obviously. It was pro-Soviet, obviously. The guy was writing in the 50s. He wasn't crazy, right? But there's too much Jewish stuff in there. You understand? It called attention to the Jewish Holocaust. You're not allowed to do that. I'm simply saying that aside from the physical extermination, you get what you can call cultural extermination, in which I'm not going to kill you, but you better never say anything that you're Jewish. In fact, they just wrote a book the other day. I mentioned it was a book review in my sermon this morning. The book Smugglers, if any of you have seen it. It's an interesting book by Professor Fishman from the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's about Yivo and how the Germans killed everybody in the Vilna again and stole all the books, and what happened to it at the end. And even when the war's over, the Soviets steal the books. And the Soviets, that's my point. The Soviets, these Yiddishist Jews who were in La La Land, because they were, the Yiddish are a little nuts. So they, because they thought this is the future of Judaism. They meant well, but, and they're surprised that under Stalin, you can't talk about the Jewish books, about the Yiddish books. They bury them in some cellar somewhere until communism ends. And it's a whole long story. It's very well written. You could, like I said before, I'm sure you read a lot worse things than this. So it illustrates just what I was saying, that in a non-Jewish European environment, there's no room for anything Jewish. You get it? As such. So this actually was, what shall I say, a confirmation of the Zionist thesis. That's my point. And so, in World War II, let's be honest, Europe plays an ambiguous role vis-a-vis the Shoah. Let's be honest here, most Europeans acquiesced with a more or less guilty conscience. How could, as I say, but let's be honest over here, as Jabotinsky would have said. How could a Pole, a Lithuanian, a Slovak not be happy at the disappearance of the Jews? I mean, let's be honest. All these stores are gone, so they're not going to have a store. It's just a fact. All the physicians are gone. It's not going to have a practice. You can't deny this. You understand? All the workers in the post office are gone. So my kids can get a job. This is what Jabotinsky called the anti-Semitism of things, the objective anti-Semitism. The work structure and the economy and the heavy presence of Jews was so calculated that, they'll admit it, they won't admit it, they say it's a good thing they got rid of all these people. For my money, he could have sent them to Palestine, could have sent them to Madagascar, whatever, they kill him, not kill him, but that great house over there, I can never afford to move in that neighborhood. Now I can move for the neighborhood. You can't deny these things. This is a reality of Europe. They don't like to talk about, but was a fact. Even Western Europe, even in Western European countries, were anti-Semitic to one degree or another. I'm talking about during the war. Many Frenchmen helped the Germans. Many Dutch, for example, helped the Germans. We like to make movies about the people who did, and they deserve it. No question about that. You understand? But there were plenty that did. And if you start taking numbers, we're the majority. What's the answer? Okay? And I'm telling you, my mother, as you know, was saved by good Slovaks, so to speak. But how many were like that? So the fact is, Europe and the Holocaust is a funny relationship. Yes, Denmark, here, let's show this thing, is the exception. But that's it, okay? And Denmark is the exception. Here's Copenhagen when the Germans occupied in World War II. And Denmark is a tiny, assimilated Jewish community. I think it's 4,000 or 5,000 Jews altogether. It's a very small population. And it so happened that the king, if you see him riding on the street over there, King Christian X, he didn't wear a Jewish star, that's a legend, but he put out the cultural word that we're opposed to the oppression of the Jewish minority. Okay? That he did do. I can tell you this story, this is real. In 1939, he called the chief rabbi, just before the war, called the chief rabbi of Copenhagen. He said, I want to come make an official visit to the synagogue, which he didn't do often. And the chief rabbi said something like, you think in this time it's the right move? And he said, you're an idiot. This time is exactly the right move. In other words, this is the time to do it. You think I want to visit Shul, This is the time to do it. So I just gave you the exception. Okay? All the other countries were not like that. All right? That's enough. Now, the only explicit European opponents of anti-Semitism in general, and Hitler in particular, was the British. That's a fact. Okay? Here's Churchill issuing a statement in 41. This is before Pearl Harbor, in which he said, none has suffered more, this is Churchill talking, none has suffered more cruelly than the Jews of the unspeakable evils wrought on bodies and spirits of men by Hitler's vile regime, Prime Minister Churchill said in London, Jewish Chronicle. No, he wrote an open letter to the Jewish paper. That's making a statement volume, because this time is exactly when all the killing's going on. And he assured the Jews, in the day of victory, the Jews suffering his part will not be forgotten. This is the first statement made by a member of the British government concerning the future of Jews' defeat of Nazism, be published tomorrow in the Jewish Chronicle, and it reads, on the occasion of the centenary of Jewish Chronicle, which is, the Jewish Times of England, which is a landmark history of British Jewry, I send a message of good cheer to the Jewish people in this and other lands. Hard to get good cheer in November of 1941. None has suffered more cruelly than the Jew unspeakable evil of body and by spirit and vile regime. Jew bore the brunt. Nazis' first onslaught, the citadels of freedom, human dignity, the Jew is born and continues to bear a burden that might seem beyond endurance. Now I want to tell you something, by the way. The British, early on, they were good in cracking the codes. I think you know that from the movies now, right? From the Alan Turing movies. But earlier than that, they cracked the easy codes. What were the easy codes? The police codes. So they, already in 41, they could read, we're shooting 500 Jews here, 10,000 Jews there. In other words, Churchill actually knew what's going on. As he says, beyond endurance, he is not allowed to break his spirit. He will never lose the will to resist. Day of victory to Jews, sufferings in his part will not be forgotten. Once again, appointed time, you will see vindicated the principles of righteousness, which is the glory of his fathers proclaimed to the world. And it will be shown that though the mills of God grind slowly, they grind small. We'll get all the Nazi war criminals. That, of course, did not happen, unfortunately. But my point is like this. There's no other head of state in Europe that would make anything close to a pro-Jewish statement in 1941. Even the ones that were, so to speak, leaving the Jews alone didn't want to boast about it. You see? So this is, once again, an exception that bears the rule. And I would point out, in 1943, if we go to the next one, when the chief rabbi of England, 43, in the middle of the war, Hertz, like the Hertz sitter, Chief Rabbi Hertz, was 30 years in office, so he got to be a companion of the Garter or the Bath or something like that, one of those titles, which they give as an honorific. And the ceremony involves, it's a good story, the ceremony, by the way, he was a frum guy. He doesn't have a yarmulke here because he's meeting with the Polish ambassador, but he was a religious Jew. And listen to this, the ceremony is to have dinner or lunch with the King of England in Windsor Castle, and which is a high honor, in England. And what are you going to do to the chief rabbi? It's a kosher vegetarian lunch. Meaning they had just vegetables, because it's a symbol. But it's a powerful symbol. It's 1943, and England is saying like this, is that we respect the Jews. It's not a small thing. You get it? It's not a small thing. Now, the United States of America, I might say, was in the background. People today make fun of Roosevelt, but FDR was the only leader, as you see, to forcefully condemn anti-Semitism, even though he's far from perfect. So this is the Europe in World War II. So if you're a European, my point is, you relate to World War II differently than if you're an American. World War II was the good war, as they say. It's black and white. We're the good guys, the Germans were the bad guys, we came and liberated Europe, we didn't do anything wrong, correct? We have nothing to apologize for. They didn't persecute any minorities in this country. We went over and liberated them. So for America, they look back and if you're a Frenchman, if you're Italian, even if you're Belgian and Dutch, and certainly if you're German and those kind of Central European country, you look back to war years. One question you don't necessarily want to ask is, so what did you do in the war, Grandpa? You understand? You hear what I'm saying? And who owned this grocery store before you acquired it in 1942? You get it? So keep this in mind. Now, I might also point out that after the defeat of Germany in 1945, Western Europe was reorganized and reconstructed by the USA. That's what happened. The Americans are the ones who had the money. Nobody had the money. We had all the money. And the Europeans had none. To be in the good graces of the Americans, the Western European countries that were reconstructed after World War II had to conform to liberal American hashkafas vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, which in the eyes of America had been irremediably tainted by Hitler. So before the war, you could have these anti-Semitic parties. You cannot have this in France, Germany, those kind of places. I don't care. They may have wanted to, they may not, may yes, but the U.S. was pulling the strings. As a matter of fact, as you can see up here, we made Western Europe, and we made them do what they should have done themselves, okay? It was Truman and those guys that made the Marshall Plan. They really made the NATO, and they even made the European Union, what they used to call it, the common market, right? All that sort of thing has its origins in the American occupation of Western Europe after the war. This is the only country where we wanted to pull our troops out, if you remember this, and they said, Cape Mare, right? I might point out, the United States still has, this is amazing, the United States still has military bases in Germany because the Germans say don't go. You understand? There's no country that there's still occupation forces in a country. The Germans say don't leave. You understand? So part of that was you have to Americanize. And in the post-war America, anti-Semitism and anything that toes that is out. Okay? So whatever the Europeans may or may not have wished to do, the hard right in Europe is distinctly marginalized for 70 years in politics and in culture. It's important. So again, France, Germany, Scandinavia, Italy, those places, the extreme right parties, they're there because you have a free country, but they're distinctly marginalized. The right is only reviving now, as you know, if you follow the news, because of the Muslim invasion of Europe. That's the reason, otherwise it wouldn't happen. It's a reaction to that, okay? To kiss up to the Americans, the Western European countries make nice after the Second World War with their small, decimated local Jewish populations. So there aren't any problems for you as a Jew in Holland, even in Germany and Italy and those countries after the war, because if you're in Western Europe, you got to conform, so to speak, to American ideals. Psychologically and culturally, these European countries struggled to find a proper relationship to the Shoah, which had just taken place. That is a whole subject that I could spend a lot of time on, and I'm not going to. Here, that would be a subject of European cultural history. How do they struggle in the 40s and 50s and 60s to relate to what I just said before? That everybody knows Hitler was bad, but my uncle was a member of the party. Things like that. Historically, Europeans are what they call sacro egoissimo. They have this sacred egoism. And they're not given the critical self-reflection. It's not a European trait. So especially in those years, they didn't want to say, like, we did a sin against the Jews, and how can we do this, all the rest of it. But on the other hand, the Holocaust just happened, right? Wasn't that long ago. Everybody remembers it. And so you can't literally deny that it wasn't there. In the 1940s, in the second half of the 1940s, the easiest way to deal with this is to support the rise of Israel. If you're a European politician, like the French leaders, Bidot, well, he's Jewish, but he said Bidot and the others, I don't know what they did in World War II, but when World War II is over, they said, I guess we're helping Israel. This is our way of saying, we're not going to discuss the Holocaust, but we're helping the Jewish people. You understand? And by the way, it was a help for the Jewish people. These are people got arms to the Haganah and the Irgun. They helped with the Bricha, with the illegal immigrants in 46, 47, 48. I mean, they really did do of help, and that's their way of saying, we're not talking about what happened in the war, we're just saying we're helping the Jews, mikan ulahaba, from now on, and the way you do that of most utility is to help the rise of Israel. So Zionism became sort of like a substitute for an intelligent discussion on what happened during the Holocaust. Once Israel became a state, and a state hated by the Arab world, relations between Israel and the West Europeans became interesting. There was a tension between not wishing to antagonize the Arabs on the one hand versus sympathy for the Holocaust, which did exist, even if it's not articulated so well, on the other hand. And so all the countries have to work out their relationship this way. In fact, and I've touched on this in my past talks, as you know, during the Ben Gurion era, Israel was able to build on this to establish a set of special relationships, which saw unusual ties between the Jewish state on the one hand and the European-specific countries on the other, in which they didn't have normal diplomatic relations, but they had unusually cozy ones. This is in Ben Gurion era. So it's not that long after the war. For example, take a look at France. The French are anti-Semitic, historically, but as you know, and by the way, there was and is a strong sentiment of anti-Israelism in the French foreign ministry and those foreign policy elites. There always was, and even the 40s and 50s. But it was countered and trumped by powerful sympathy that people like Shimon Peres and others were able to locate within France in the French body politic. And there you have General Koenig kissing up with Moshe Dayan in the 50s. He gave him the Legion of Honor. And look at the next one. As Koenig was Aryeh Levin, he came to Israel. General Koenig was the #1 French general in World War II. I'm talking about who fought the Germans. It was General Latre and Tassigny and General Koenig. And so he was defense minister and other things like this. And these guys went to Israel, had a love affair with Israel, okay? And to them, if it's the 40s, if it's the 50s, even if it's the early 60s, Israel is the Maquis fighting the Nazis. Nasser is a fascist, is a Nazi. That's what they are. You understand? When you're helping Israel, you're doing what Nebuch we should have done 20 years ago, as the expression goes, because there shouldn't be another Holocaust in the state of Israel. Because if the Arabs win, they will not hesitate. And so France has to do to help Israel, is it's like we're continuing the fight of the resistance against the Nazi occupation. This is how they thought. And based on this, Israel was able, as you know, we talked about before, to build an unusual relationship, and that's how they got the A-bomb. Isn't that true? Right? I mean, who gave them Dimona? You see? It was the French connection that I've talked about in the past. In the late 50s, off the books, nobody's looking. And why did French politicians like Bourges-Monnery and Koenig and the other guys, who were totally non-Jewish, no Jewish connection whatsoever, why did they do this? They knew, although they didn't say it out loud, this was going to use. Ben Gurion said we need it for a textile factory. Remember that? So he says they knew what's happening, but they said like this: Israel's a special case because this was the Holocaust, and if the Arabs win, they'll do it again. So therefore, even though we're not in favor of giving countries the atomic energy, Israel's a special case. So that's my point of a special relationship. Another special relationship was of all countries with Germany. I'm talking about West Germany. They existed once upon a time. Ben Gurion and these guys were cozy with the Krauts. True? I mean, he was tight with Konrad Adenauer, and these are the right wing. Adenauer is the right wing of the German politics. Okay? and Konrad Adenauer built West Germany. It's a fact, okay? And look at this. This is even better. This is Franz Josef Strauss. He was the head of the Christian Social Union in Bavaria. In other words, that's a very right-wing party in the German politics, even today, but it's starting in the 50s. Franz Josef Strauss. Franz Josef Strauss was a German officer in World War II. Let's get this straight. He's a Catholic guy, German officer in World War II and the Eastern Front and all this kind of stuff. He was a crowd. But when he starts a new political career in the New Germany, he is very right-wing. And, let me put it this way. None of us would feel comfortable in one of these conventions that they have with the lederhosen and all that stuff. He is Israel's number one friend for getting weapons. You see? Now, what does that mean? It's just what I told you. I don't want to talk about what I did in the war. What counts is what happens now, and nobody's giving Israel the tanks that they need, and I'm going to get it for you, he says to Shimon Peres. And the missiles, and the submarines, and the ammo, and all the other kind of business that Israel's going crazy about, because the United States of America will not sell it to them under Eisenhower. Remember that? So where did they get it? So he ended up getting from Germany. In fact, if you recall, he even gave Israel, the government fell on this in 1957 in Israel. He even gave Israel to help. He gave Israel the contract to make the German uniforms. You get it? In Kiryat Ata, that was the Histadrut, the textile mill. So I get it. You hear the word, right? Because, by the way, it's 500,000 men. That's a great contract. Strictly from a business point of view, that's a great contract. But when the workers found out in Israel they're making contract for the German army, all hell broke loose, you know what I mean? And it caused a government crisis. I'm simply saying like this. You would not imagine that a right-wing politician, which he certainly was, but this is how he shows, I'm right-wing, but I'm not Nazi. You know what I'm saying? I'm not Hitler at all. In fact, I want to help the Jews. And I'm helping the Jews not with words, but with deeds. Or more exactly, with submachine guns and Leopard tanks and these kind of, because Ben-Gurion will say like this, words we don't need, practical things we need. So it's a crazy idea. I might point out also, Adenauer, whatever you want to say, gave Israel in 52 $850 million, which is like $8.5 billion today, over 10 years, and they gave billions more, as you know, to individual Jews and all the rest of it. That doesn't excuse the war, but that's state to state, $8 billion in American money today, $800 million in money that way. Those are checks cut by Germany to Israel, or more exactly, they did it in goods. This is not your typical relationship. You understand? What is Germany saying by all this? We're sorry about the Holocaust. We're not saying that this makes up for it, but in fact, Adenauer was extremely uncomfortable, if you know who he was, and that whole generation of talking about what happened in the war. But it's the kind of attitude which said like this, let's not talk about the war, but I can be of practical help now. And Ben-Gurion was, Israel was on the ropes. They needed, more than anything else, like I say, the practical help. I might point out that Germany, till this day, is the only European country to give significant annual economic aid to Israel. You probably don't know that, unless you follow these things. The French don't give Israel any money. You see what I'm saying? The Benelux countries, the British don't do it. Germany, till this day, gives Israel a fair amount of money. Then there's a special relationship with England, who used to be opposed to the rise of the State of Israel. England had a special relationship after the Sinai campaign. Remember that, when England and France and Israel colluded to invade the Sinai desert in 1956. After it's all over, Anthony Eden, who was anti-Israel, but had been caught as part of the collusion, he was incredibly grateful to Ben-Gurion that Ben-Gurion didn't tell on him, because he never did. And then he changed 180 degrees, and the British government in the late 50s and the 60s actually did a lot of favors for Israel. For example, they gave them the heavy water for the A-bomb. This was found a couple years ago, meaning that England bought it from Norway and then gave it to Israel. This under Macmillan. So I'm simply pointing out that Israel, in the 10, 20 years after the Holocaust, after the rise of Israel, I might say, actually developed unusually cozy relationships, not just regular relationships, with a bunch of Western European countries, even though it was off the books officially. I would point out that England in the late 50s and 60s sold Israel the best tanks in the world, or the Centurion tanks. They had the Rolls-Royce engines and so forth. I mean, these are not small things. Another country that Israel had unusual relationships was the Dutch, Netherlands. Okay, whatever they did in the war, after the war, they were all supposed to be Simon pure. Joseph Luns, if anybody remembers him, a name from yesteryear, he was Secretary General of NATO for a while, but he was the Dutch foreign minister for 20 years. And he was a very close friend of Israel. There he was with Ben Gurion, visiting Israel. And he was a major name in European politics and statesmanship. And he was exactly one of these guys who said, after Hitler, Holland, the Dutch have a special obligation to help Israel. Maybe you remember that when the Soviet Union broke relations with Israel, it was the Dutch that had the Jewish interest section, the Israeli interest section in Moscow. You understand? So they were identified for a long time with having a positive relation with Israel. Not today, but at that time. Now, until 1967, Israel was not perceived by Western Europe as occupying any Arab land or people, right? This is the old map. So as far as the Europeans are concerned, it is all Jewish territory. They didn't say, what are you doing to the Arab population in the Galil, and the kind of thing you would have with CNN today, and Ben Gurion had that martial law, remember, the military government for the Arab population in Israel during his time. They couldn't go anywhere. Europe said like this: here's the Arab part, here's the Jewish part, and they should make peace, like that. Israel was not seen as, as an occupier. But all that, of course, changed with the Six-Day War, did it not? In the beginning, right after the Six-Day War, it looked as Israel would be able to negotiate some deal with the Arabs. And Israel, therefore, was given moral credit by the Europeans. But as time unfolded, no deal appeared, as we've spoken about here. And it became clear that Israel actually would like to maintain the occupation, which we're not. And they don't like this, the Europeans don't like to see these kind of pictures. You understand? Because occupation has a plus side and a minus side. It's a big minus side. It's you're controlling a civilian population. These pictures don't do well in Europe. And so Europe starts being torn after 1967 between positive images of Israel and negative ones. In order to understand this, it's necessary to realize that by 1970 or so, Europe had developed a strong leftist tradition in terms of culture and economics in a way that's not true of the U.S. Europe is a frankly, Western Europe after the Second World War is a frankly leftist, social democratic kind of set of countries. So I say, Trump could never get elected in Europe. You understand? He obviously can get elected in America. He cannot get elected in Europe because the whole culture is so extremely predisposed against anything smacking of this that I don't think, in other words, no conservative Republican could, besides Donald Trump. No conservative Republican could. So Western Europe, now it's time to make a point. Western Europe, certainly since 1945, has embraced Marxism. Let's be clear about that. Western Europe has embraced Marxism. The question is, democratic Marxism, which they call social democracy, or dictatorial Marxism. But they are Marxist in their official, secular, cultural direction. Now the question within Marxism, the great question of the 20th century is, this type or that type? The dictatorship type of Marxism or the democratic type of Marxism? Meaning, which is the ikker? Is political democracy the main thing, and social justice hopefully will go along with that at some pace or another? Or is the regime of economic justice the supreme value, and to hell with democracy? Okay, which is Lenin, right? That's Lenin, correct? That in order to establish an economic just society, you have to have the dictatorship of the proletariat. Remember that jargon? And that's another word for saying you have to have a police state to make a just society. Okay, so Karl Marx never made it clear which is the ikker, and therefore there were these big battles and debates, and still are in certain circles. Now, although there is a radical left in Western Europe, especially in France and Italy, there is, it's the non-radical, it's the democratic Marxists who predominate in the political system. And they create, in country after country, in Germany, in Holland, in Belgium, in Scandinavia, in Italy, what's left, and then all one country after another. I mean, that's what they do. In Austria, that's what they create. In Europe, a social welfare system, explicitly so. It's a frank social welfare system with free everything. Nothing to talk about. It's high taxes, it's free health, it's free education, free college, free vacations, free everything. Bernie is running on this. I want to point out to you, he was elected as a socialist, not as a Democrat. He ran for the Democratic nomination and got close, but he had to join the Democratic Party at the beginning of last year, 2 years ago, beginning of 2016. He had to join the Democratic Party to run for their nomination. He was not elected to the Senate on a Democratic ticket or to the House when he was there before in Vermont. Vermont's an unusual state, but it's just an interesting fact. He ran as an independent socialist. Okay, he's the only one. So I'm simply saying, what was he advocating? At free college, for example, and things like that. Well, you are, and he said, I mean, I'm not saying, he's not hiding any of this. He said, this is what they have in Europe, why are we behind in Europe? So he's a European social democrat, which is a socialist democrat, and he wanted to bring that here, and he had his following, and those who support him and those who opposed him. So I'm simply trying to say, if you want to understand Europe, down till today, the word social democratic or social democracy are two very important terms that Americans usually don't hear, and they are not America. They have a different system over there. Increasingly, this social democratic, interestingly, this trend of social democratic did not really take off anywhere outside of Western Europe. I was sitting back the other day thinking about it. You don't have it anywhere else, although the third world's all designated themselves that way. So Idi Amin said he's a social democrat. Assad, I promise, Assad is an Arab Socialist Union, so they say it's a social democrat. They just have to establish a firm system before they can do the whole business. Nasser was the personification of Arab socialism, which meant social democracy through an Arab lens. But of course, these were all dictatorships. No, they were liars, okay? This puzzled the Europeans because everybody thought that the new third world countries that are popping up like mushrooms after World War II, literally dozens of them, they're all going to become social democracies like Europe. And the Europeans try to be philosophically liberal about it. They say it's due to our colonial mistreatment of them. We left aside a bad legacy in Africa and Asia, and that's why democracy hasn't taken off there, and so on and so on, and that's why they all turned into penny-ante dictatorships. But it happened. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is there's about one country I can think of, maybe two, but one country outside of Europe that was a social democracy, and that's Israel. In the early years, it was a socialist country. The government was socialist, and it was democratic. It's interesting. If you're a European, you look at the map, where are the social democracies in South Africa, in South America? Where are the social democracies in Asia? Maybe we could debate about India. India under Nehru and all that kind of was sort of a social democracy, but it didn't work exactly. It was all messed up. And eventually, Indira Gandhi for a while suspended the constitution, so that's a very complicated case. Israel is a sort of where else? Japan's not a socialist country. Where else? Go throughout all of Asia. Maybe you can think of something I can't think of. So go through Africa and go through Asia and go through South America. Antarctica, as far as I understand, is not a social democratic country. And so where is it? The answer is it's nowhere except Israel. Isn't that interesting? It's nowhere except Israel. And so if you're a socialist, you believe in this kind of stuff, and it's the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Israel is a special place in your heart, because that's one country in which actually the Socialist Party is predominant. As a matter of fact, the Histadrut, as they call it, for good or bad, controlled the main levers of the economy. It's not a police state. It's not a dictatorship. There actually is freedom of speech. You understand? Freedom of the press. And so it's a social democracy. The fact that Israel was a real social democracy was a very important factor in affording Israel a positive image in the eyes of Europe in those years. Indeed, Israel, as I said, did have a democratically elected socialist government. The kibbutz, remember this yesteryear, was once upon a time the epitome of democratic socialism. Now they say it's a racist bastion because they won't let the Arabs work there. But I'm talking about at that time. Mitterrand, I remember this, the president of France, his son went to work as a volunteer in around 1970, along with a lot of other people, not Jewish, to experience the kibbutz, lifestyle for a semester or something like that, because they looked once upon a time, Europe, they said, oh, Israel, it's a real, the kibbutz, everybody owns everything, it's mamish socialism, and it's not a dictatorship, you can leave. You understand? It's not there. I remember Stalin's in World War II, when there was a great alliance of England, America, and Soviet Russia. And so everybody's trying to get along with each other. And the Russian ambassador to London, a famous Soviet diplomat, Ivan Maysky, visited Palestine. And they took him, and the Jews were, oh boy, Soviet Russia. Everybody thought at that time, Stalin is great. And they took him to a kibbutz. And they said, see, we got the real collective farm here, which they did. We got the real collective farm, the kolkhoz. And Macy's looked like this, because they showed him everything. He says, where's the prison here? He said, we don't have a prison, it's all voluntary. And Macy went like this. I get it, you know what I'm saying? We do that in Russia too, you understand? And you couldn't convince the guy, there's no jail. You see, whoever's here wants to be here or wants to leave can leave. So if you're Western European, you know all this and you say, wow, this is great, okay? Now, if you think about it, as I said before, there's only Western Europe and Israel. That's interesting. The United States is not a social democracy, correct? Especially from the European point of view. On the other hand, there was the negative image of Israel as the oppressor of the Palestinians. The PLO and company gained unprecedented traction by the early 1970s. There is sympathy with the skyjackers more than with the victims. Remember that? We talked about it. Lila Khaled and others, people say, oh, she's conducting a noble struggle. We're not, what's the expression go? We're not condoning violence, but she's right. So why? Here's very interesting. The Western European countries do not want to be dragged into a war with the Arab terrorist groups. They don't want to. The Europeans really, really, really do not want to fight anybody, because it'll be, from their point of view, a Vietnam, a potential Vietnam. This is historic. The old European attitude, this is centuries old, going back, into my knowledge, to the 15th century, of the European attitude towards the Barbary pirates and the corsairs. Okay? I talked about it in the past. You used to have, today the term is jihadist Islamic extremism. But once upon a time, they were called the Barbary pirates, meaning the different Arab and Muslim states on the coast of North Africa. So what you call today Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Libya and so forth, all right? And these guys had a whole war, there's reasons, but they had a whole tradition of sending out attacking ships. They used to call them the corsairs, pirate ships, that they would go and seize Christian European ships and take the cargo and enslave everybody and bring them back to great slave markets in Morocco and in Tunisia and all these other places. So in other words, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, Italian, Englishmen, Irishmen, things like that. You'll be shocked to hear that in the late 1600s, the corsairs raided and captured a whole village in Connecticut. They sailed the doggone Atlantic Ocean in the 17th century, like that. And they took, once in a while, in fact, Baltimore, I think, in Ireland was seized by a bunch of Arabs at once upon a time. So you had a continuous policy of terrorism, the old equivalent of skyjacking, okay? What did the Europeans do about it? 95% of the time, paid them off. The attitude was, it's a mafia, you pay protection money, and that's the best you can do. To fight a war, and who knows where it'll land, and it'll cost a lot of money, this, that, and the other. So they took a very cynical attitude. And what about the thousands of prisoners? Once in a while, you buy them back, you do something like that. Most of them were condemned to live the rest of their lives, in slavery. And that's what happened, get over it. They didn't develop a very strong tradition of pidyon shvuyim the ways the Jews did. They did have some, Catholic Church in particular. They did have certain groups there. And by the way, this is a very honorable part of the Islamic war culture. I think many of you will remember, last year, 2 years ago, there was this Jewish guy in Canada, and he said he can get the Yazidi girls out by paying them. Do you remember this in the news? He said, they captured all these girls in fighting in ISIS, in the Yazidi, which to them is a pagan cult, and they got these women in slave markets and mamish, literally today in 2017, 2016, slave markets, and nobody was doing anything about it. And this guy, he's a Jewish guy from Canada, if I remember correctly. He said, I have contacts, and basically, give me $1,000, I can get a girl out, or something like that. And so, let's do it. Because that's part of culture. So, is a machlokes how to deal with this. You understand? Do you pay them off, or at least say, I'm not going to get into a fight with you, and just transfer this to the 1970s and the Arab-Israeli Palestinian skyjacker terrorist model. It's the same thing. That's what the Europeans always did, and that's what they continue to do. In the United States of America, it's a very interesting history. We have different policies. President George Washington and President John Adams said pay. And the United States of America, from the very beginning, in the times of the Articles of Confederation, and during the administration of George Washington, and during the administration of John Adams, it was part of the federal budget. You pay protection money to Algiers and Tunisia and the other Barbary pirates, and that way, when they see a flag with the American, a ship with the American flag, they'll leave it alone. Old way. Of all people, Thomas Jefferson, who was a tightwad and a pacifist, he couldn't take it, and when he became president, of all people, Thomas Jefferson, the first thing he did was construct a real navy and send it over there to fight the Barbary pirates, if you remember this, okay? That's why they got from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The Bashaw of Tripoli, which is Libya today, Gaddafi, he was a big pirate lord, and he had all these ships attacking America. They had American prisoners, slaves over there, and as far back as that, they did. So this country has a set of traditions. In fact, this is the state of Maryland. The number one Arab fighter in the state of Maryland is Stephen Decatur from Maryland, from the Eastern Shore, right? Decatur High, and he's the one who said, "My country right or wrong." And Stephen Decatur was famous because he really was like a John Wayne. All kidding aside, you read up on him, you'll see. He was a naval officer, and he led these raids on these Arab things where he did, maybe Errol Flynn is a better term. He had to go in and fight with these guys with the swords and all this kind of business, and rescue prisoners and burn down these pirate places, and they would go after him. And there was this big ship to Philadelphia that ran aground in the harbor, I think, of Tunis, and he burned the ship so the Arabs wouldn't get it. I mean, this country had a war. You understand? Once upon a time with all that. That's where the leathernecks come from. Because the Arabs used to have that neck, what do you call it? Yeah, besides that, no, you go for the neck. It's true. I mean, it's true. So you go for the neck. So the Marines, as learning on the job, they tied leather around. So then you go like this. They won't cut the leather, So it's a leather neck. Now you can go in jeopardy, Now, you read up now on Stephen Decatur. Now, the French, bring it back to the 1970s, lead the way by cutting a devil's deal around 1970. Basically, they tell Arafat and these guys, there was a whole set of terrorist groups, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front, and so forth. We won't interfere in your terrorist activities or interrupt your networks in France if you refrain from hijacking French planes, and as long as you don't hurt anybody on French soil. Okay? By the 1970s, France has moved very far from the old days, and they moved to a strong anti-Israel policy because it's so profitable. The French are the French. And so the two presidents, Pompidou and Giscard d'Estaing, in the 1970s, they made a lot of money on oil deals and armaments deals and all kind of things like that. They gave the French economy billions and millions, and the price was stick it to Israel. So what? No, that's it. So what? It's in the interest of France, and that, of course, is sacred. Now, these are Gaullist presidents. In France, there is a socialist party and the Gaullist party. The Gaullist party was the right-wing party, although it wasn't very right-wing, but it's the right-wing party in France. They're the anti-Israel party. Charles de Gaulle was the leader of the trend, already from the time he became president of the Republic in 1958, I think, away from Israel. And therefore, the three presidents that are Gaullist basically in a row, Giscard was sort of Gaullist. That's a long time, but about 20 years in France, a distinctly anti-Israel policy. When the socialists come back, which we'll deal with maybe next year, with Mitterrand, it got a little bit better because the socialists have a tradition in France, as I told you before, of being more pro-Israel. So you have to know the political culture of each and every European government. Israel knows this. They got to, right? Israel knows it, of course. When the Yom Kippur War breaks out in 1973, and then the oil embargo, France just loses it. They kiss up to the Arabs at the UN and elsewhere, and they join the new and disturbing trend of delegitimizing rhetoric. So Michel Joubert, the disgusting French foreign minister in Kissinger's time, is always saying Israel is acting like racist. We have to question whether this really is a regular country to be a member of the UN. Where did this come from? You see? And then France wants and Joubert says, I demand France has a major chelik in the peace process. Kissinger says, I'm going to think about it very heavily. You understand? I will call you the first time, that's what happened. Can you just imagine that? Then Britain is a very weird story in the 70s or 60s, 70s, because British politics is dominated by two very different men from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. One is Harold Wilson from the Labour Party, that's the Socialist Party. The Labour Party in England is the Socialist Party. And then Edward Heath from the Conservative Party at that time. He's before Margaret Thatcher. And let me put it this way. Harold Wilson, who's the head of the Labour Party, if you know who he was an extremely good friend of Israel. It's a weird part of his biography, because he was a politician and a half, and I don't say he was the greatest prime minister England ever had, but he had an unbelievable soft spot for Israel. This is, he was in love, this is really true. He was in love with Israel, even though it doesn't exactly make so much sense to me. He sees it as a heroic social democracy fighting for its life. I'll tell you again, with him in Downing Street, it's a good thing for Israel in 67 that he was the prime minister. Look, the guy wrote a book idolizing Israel. Look at that, right? There's no British prime minister that wrote a book saying, I love Israel, okay? But Wilson did. Okay, so I'm just saying, can you imagine today a British politician would do something like that? Now, Edward Heath, Ted Heath is a cold fish on Israel. He follows the Foreign Office, which is stay away from Israel, do whatever you need to do formally, but, our fate, England lies with the Arabs, okay? And therefore you have a tug of war in British policy in the 60s and 70s, which tendency will predominate. Wilson had the Foreign Office guys trying to push him towards the Arabs, and he fought them, okay? Here, look at this. As Prime Minister, Wilson was determined, says his biographer, to expiate the sins of Ernest Bevin. Hear that? So he saw the fact. Let me put it this way. Harold Wilson was a labor intellectual from a working class family, and he had an important job in World War II when the British government, with the, I forget what, the psychological war or something like that, fighting the Germans. So he was one of those non-Jews who really took the Holocaust to heart, okay? He was scarred by the Holocaust. I mean that in a good way. Every person in Europe ought to have been scarred by the Holocaust, okay? And he was one of those types. You had some in America like this who said, Israel's a special case, and these guys are fighting not to have another Holocaust, and that's how I view the reality of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And on appointing him foreign secretary, he told Jim Callahan, you can have a free hand. In other words, you're the foreign secretary. You can cover all of England's foreign policy everywhere except two places, South Africa and Israel. Right? Now, he was against South Africa, but as a part of that, he's pro-Israel. You see that? When Nasser closed the Straits of Tehran, Wilson pledged that England would promote and secure free passage. They didn't, but at least he said the right things. Okay? During the Yom Kippur War, unfortunately, the Prime Minister of England was Heath. And he was anti-Israel, as I said before, and therefore, when Kissinger and Nixon say, where can we land the planes? And by the way, and some of you I see in the audience know this firsthand, the United States has an extremely close security relationship with England. Most people don't even have an idea, till today. The United States, America, and Great Britain, ever since the end of World War II, it's a long time, have a very close sharing relationship with Britain. At the level of intelligence and the military stuff, all the rest of it. This is the only time in the 70 years when England said you can't use our air bases, airfields. Because Nixon said, I got to fly the planes to help Israel that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, right? And England said no. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the type of person that he was. The 1974 oil embargo drives Edward Heath to radical measures because there were a lot of massive strikes in England, which leads to an election because the country was shattering, and he fell. And Wilson came back, which was lucky for the government of Yitzhak Rabin. Okay? So there's Rabin and Harold Wilson. So for 74, 75, 76, then when Wilson left, Israel had like a bright moment, so to speak, as far as England, as far as Britain is concerned. So it does depend who's in charge. What I'm trying to show you is Harold Wilson is the 180 degrees opposite of Jeremy Corbyn. That's my point. Okay? So as a result, in the mid-'70s, the UK did not support the Arafat craze when he went to the UN and all these sort of things. The Foreign Office professionals, like the State Department professionals, like that, the Arafat business, but they're not the decision makers on this in the mid-1970s. So one more country we have to consider, and that's Germany. It's very controversial. Here we have, I told you, or my thesis tonight is, that every country in Europe is different, and they have their political chemistry, and you just got to know, in some cases it's the right-wing parties that are pro-Israel, in some cases the left-wing parties pro-Israel, and Israel has to maneuver within all this, because what choice do they have? It so happens that the funny thing, in the case of Germany, it's the right-wing party that's always been better for Israel. There are two big parties in Germany, the CDU and the SDP. The CDU is the Christian Democratic Union, as Konrad Adenauer, right? I always love this campaign poster, because the opposite of America. Obama ran on the slogan, change. Remember that? Adenauer ran on the program, no change. Kind of experiment. Vote for me, I'm going to keep thinking exactly like they are. And he won every time. So different cultures have a different approach to slogans, you understand? And this is his successor, Erhard, what do you call it? Welfare for all. That's a Bernie, Wolfstand for all. So the CDU was the party of Adenauer and Strauss and these other guys. They were good for Israel. Starting in 1970, from 70 to 81, it was the SDP, the socialists, who were in power. Willy Brandt, if you remember that name from yesteryear. Some people will, some people won't. And then the question was, how is Israel going to get along with a socialist government, which is going to be more obviously left-leaning, and how are they going to relate to the Arab-Israeli, the Arab-Palestinian conflict? Now, Brandt did go to Israel. By the way, he made a famous gesture, if you're into gestures, when he went in 1970 to the Warsaw Ghetto. And when he visited Poland, that itself was unusual. A German leader go to Poland, and he bowed. Okay? I don't know if you can remember this. And this was supposed to, from a Christian Europe, this is a big statement. That's Brandt. And you'll see he's talking about it for a second. And then he said, we were discussing what would be the appropriate gesture. And when he got down, what he's really saying is like this: we did it. You heard of Holocaust denial? This is the opposite. You get it? And Germany is guilty. Okay? So then, that's appropriate. But of course, Israel said like this. Golda Meir says, Retzidavant, I need tanks, guns, supporting you, No, I mean, it's a fact. No, that's good. That's good, but it's not, what we need. Theoretically, the Socialist Party. Let's go to the next one. Socialist Party. Here's Brandt visiting Israel, just for the Yom Kippur War. Should have gotten along great with the Mapai and all these guys, because they're all social democrats, and to some degree, they got along, but it's not a good chemistry. He did not have the kind of chemistry with Golda Meir and the others that the other German leaders did, who made no bones about, tachlis is tachlis, and when they came to Israel, the question of, how big is the check and where do we sign? Brandt, as you see over here, was given a big reception. Once upon a time, this was news because it's the first official visit by a German prime minister to the state of Israel ever. And so, when he goes to Yad Vashem, it's the first time. And when he, speaks to Golda Meir, you can imagine this is security at the airport and all the rest of it. It's a big deal, and they fly him from the airport to...
I feel that mankind...
That's Brandt.
...would indeed be lost, but for this courage to make a new beginning. My fellow countrymen and I have deep respect for the achievements in creating within a quarter of a century and in the midst of adverse storms a democratic state which offers a secure house to a people so long living without a home.
Yes, sir. So you get the tenor of the message. They take him to Yad Vashem, and they give him the whole business. But somehow or other, during the whole 70s, things always went south with the SPD governments, with Brandt and the guy who came after him, which was Helmut Schmidt. And you'll remember, of course, the mess up of the Munich massacre. With the Germans aren't responsible in those. They didn't kill the Jewish athletes, and they simply had a screw up. They didn't know, they had no experience in counterterrorism, so they just messed that whole thing up. But of all things, in other words, but think of the symbolism. Oh yeah, Jews getting killed in Munich, and they weren't protected, and all the rest of it. It just was as bad karma, as they say over here. So Germany and Israel had like I'm doing now with my hands, had a funny relationship during the 1970s. Still, to sum up, Israel, up to the Yom Kippur War, had decent relations with all the Western European countries except for France. The Arab countries were quite frustrated by this. But then the Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo changed everything forever. The oil embargo singled out the Netherlands. You hear this? If you look at the nusach of the oil embargo, it says, we're against the United States, we're against this, and we're against the Netherlands. Those they singled out one country in Europe because the Arabs viewed the Dutch as conspicuously friendly to Israel. Now, the other members of the European Union didn't say, no, the Dutch are part of us, we stand together. They all jumped ship like a rat. You understand? And I remember the French foreign minister goes, what is anybody going to gain if France too goes on to, so much for European mutual security. The other countries didn't rally. They kowtowed to the Arabs, invited the Arab leaders in, flattered them, and issued declarations demanding Israeli withdrawal from the 1967 conquest, although in the context of a peace treaty, and it was clear that the Europeans were scared out of their minds. As I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago, the embargo lasted until March of 74, so it wasn't that long. And by that time, Kissinger said, look, we're getting Israel to move out of Egypt, we're involved in the shuttle to get them moved out of Syria, and that satisfied the Arabs. So the embargo itself did not last long, but the point had been made. Like the Maharik says in the Shulchan Aruch, if I made you do something by putting a gun to your head, then even if I put the gun back in my pocket, if you do it afterwards, it's still called oinus, it's still called under duress, because you know about the gun that I have in my pocket. Now, which is a famous word in connection with Purim, but I won't go into that. Now, listen, Europe was at the mercy of a bunch of nuts. That's the reality afterwards. Look at this. I mean, between Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Gaddafi in Libya, that's like more than half of the oil that goes to Europe. These are maniacs. If you're Europe, you say, okay, this is, it's back to the Barbary Price. Tell me what we need to do to keep these guys, an even keel, not to lose their temper at us. During the mid-70s then, leaders like Wilson and Brandt were torn between sympathy for a still social democratic Israel. I'm not up to Menachem Begin. So Israel's still a social democracy in the eyes of Europe. You hear what I'm saying? The party in power is still an explicitly social democratic party, which is part of what they call the Second International, when all the socialist leaders get together once a year or once every 2 years for schmooze and decorations, and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin will go, and they're all part of the club. Things will go really bad after Begin comes into power, because then Israel will not be viewed as a socialist country anymore. So they're torn between sympathy for a still democratic, social democratic Israel and the need to support the Arab position. Not the rejectionist Arab position, but the new one that I told you about last week that stated that the PLO was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, and that Israel should negotiate with Arafat, even though Arafat, as we all know, was tactical, strictly tactical in his attitude towards the Jewish state. I'll take a little bit today, I'll take the rest tomorrow. Every European capital now opens a PLO embassy. Every European capital. And that means that every PLO embassy now is going to be engaged as part of its activities in full-time dissemination of anti-Israel propaganda. This is a new reality in Europe that did not exist before the Yom Kippur War. There's an embassy in Vienna, for example, which their job is several things. One of their jobs is old-fashioned lobbying. You go to every college, every high school, every church group, and everything. You give them pamphlets and speakers and all this kind of stuff. Okay? This was to have great effect in affecting and molding the European opinion. I'll say it again. If you live in a European country, I'm sure it's in America too by now, but not in an official way, and Trump closed down the embassy or something like that. But if you're in London, or you're in Ireland, or in Spain, or any of those countries, you get letters at the beginning of the year. We have the following speakers, and we can send you the videos, and we can do this, that, and the other, and we'll tell you what's really going on in Israel. You understand? These are Arab speakers. So Israel's honeymoon with West Europe is then over. The only good thing in those years was that the foreign policy of Kissinger did seem to have things moving in the right direction. We're talking about 74, 75, 76, into 77. During those years, Kissinger was the Secretary of State of the United States, and the U.S. policy under Nixon and then under Ford was, as we've seen, and maybe next year you'll see the rest of it, to get Israel to pull out of the Sinai and pull out eventually of the Golan and pull out eventually of the Golan of the West Bank, not in one time, but little by little. And since things were going in that direction, so what can Europe say? In other words, this is the right way. They like Kissinger, they didn't like Kissinger. He's doing the right thing. They knew it's hard and it's going to happen. So that relieved Israel of a certain pressure, because Israel could say, listen, we're negotiating with Kissinger. I would also point out that the new foreign minister, Yigal Allon, he was the foreign minister for 3 years under Rabin, proved to be very good with the Western Europeans. He's an underestimated person in Israeli history. He's not very well known. He's a very capable individual, and the time when he was a foreign minister in the mid-70s, he put a lot of time and effort into Western Europe, which was not a dumb thing. And he went there and talked to these guys, Yom and Valayla, and it had a report. Let's put it this way. Here he's signing a loan. You can turn the sound off. Here he's signing a trade treaty with Genscher, the German foreign minister, and if you keep later on, you see he goes into Paris over here, and believe me, it ain't easy to yahrtzeit with the French in the Gaullist period and all the rest of it, but he does it, and he knows what to say, and he was okay. That's enough. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that. On the other hand, a number of factors, my friends, are going to cause a serious deterioration in relations between Europe and Israel as the 70s go on and afterwards. First of all, there's a hityatshvut. As we're going to see, after the Yom Kippur War, the settlement movement in Israel becomes big, right? I know Aryeh's here. I'm talking about Jews making yeshuvim in Yehuda and Shomron and Gaza even at that time. And the Europeans do not like this. This does not sell in Europe at all, not at all. And I might say like this: it brings out the side that Israel is a religious state. That's a poison to the secular Europeans. Get it? If it's a social democratic secular state, you have people like Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and all that, Abba Eban, so they're very similar to the Europeans. If it's going to be a state in which the religious become strong and dominant and maybe even predominant as a theocratic state, even though the Arabs are the same thing, but nevertheless, if that's how Israel presents, then Israel loses legitimacy in the eyes of European opinion. And let me put it this way: they're not Mike Pence, right? It's he don't have any trouble with that. He said Shechiyanu. It's inconceivable a European leader would come make a statement and make a bracha. It's inconceivable. It's not their culture. You see? One of the things the educated Europeans cannot understand about the United States is, why does religion play a role whatsoever in American politics? And religion plays a very important role in American politics, on the right and on the left. Okay? The churches and religious groups in this country are very active in presidential politics, on the right and on the left. Okay? And have been for a long time. When I was a kid, maybe not, but since the 80s, I would guess, or something like that, it is what it is, on the left and on the right. And the Europeans they can understand it. That's all you need. Happens all the time. A European goes to the south, and he said, "What is going on over here?" They look normal. It's a shopping mall, all the rest of it. And these all these Christians everywhere. In other words, the Europeans can't grasp it. To them, they're wrong, but they associate, religion with a primitive country. With if you tell me the Amish, okay, you understand? How can you talk to a European, and you'll see a college professor, an important scientist or physician, and he's a religious Christian, or even worse, a religious Jew. They can't understand that. You understand? It's a quirk. They don't understand America. So Israel is hurt very badly by this, and it means that not only is a Hasidic outfit taboo culturally in the eyes of Europeans, the kippah sruga is also no good, the knitted yarmulke. Those guys are nuts. I'll tell you again, the Europeans cannot take that. From now on, the theme of the evil settlers enters the European discourse about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it hadn't been there. European news crews will diligently document Arab dispossession and everything else if it will help the PLO propaganda immensely. I myself once took a tour a couple years ago, I think. Al was there. Do you remember there was a Swedish, I went to visit Hebron, with one of my tours I lead every year. And we went to Hebron. It was a Swedish group, and they wanted to come over and say, are you supporters of the terrible settlers? Are you this, that? Because he saw I have a yarmulke on, something like that. And, I could have been on Swedish TV as one of the anti-heroes. It's the reality today. To the French, they will interpret the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Algerian conflict, because the French had a somewhat similar situation, at least in their mind, when they had 1 million, 2 million European French settlers in Algeria, and then they had 10 million or whatever, 15 million Muslims, and there was this big war in which they kicked the French out, as you know, in the late 50s and the early 60s. And so to them, the Jews are equal to the Pieds Noirs, they call them, the old French settlers over there. Indeed, by colonialism, which is not a word you hear in America too often. I mean, you do, but not a lot. Unless you're in certain literature departments of Columbia, Ivy League universities, but not in the normal world. So by 1970s, colonialism is as great a crime as Nazism. You hear what I said? Now you say like this. That shows how dumb you are. You follow? You don't know what's going on in the au courant elite intellectual circles in Europe, for sure, and also in the United States, by the way. In European thought, thanks to European cultural developments. You probably never heard of Frantz Fanon, who was a French black guy from Martinique originally, and he was a distinguished intellectual who had a life in which he felt that he experienced racism. In France is no racism like over here. But he perceived it, and he wrote Wretched of the Earth, and look what he says. He defends the right of a colonized people to use violence to gain independence. He delineated the processes and forces leading to national independence or neo-colonialism during the decolonization movement that engulfed the world after World War II. In defense of the use of violence by colonized peoples, he argued that human beings who are not considered as such by the colonizer should not be bound by principles that apply to humanity in their attitude toward the colonizer. So just put that template on the Arab-Israeli conflict. They can kill as many Jews as they want because the Jews are colonizers. You understand? And the Jews, I'm saying what they say. He said, and the Jews view the Arabs as inferiors and the colonized people. Therefore, since they don't grant them to humanity, the Jews in Israel aren't deserving of humanity treatment on the part of the people struggling to gain their freedom from the oppressors. Now, you all live in a bubble in Baltimore. So you don't know what's going on. These ideas have been sweeping the third world, shall we call it, and Western Europe, particularly France. He wrote in French. In France, since the 60s. Okay? You can live your whole life in Park Heights and not know about all this, but that's what it takes. You understand? If you get out there in the broad world, or you read the New York Times review of books, or one of those types of publications, you get this all the time. Okay? And all I'm trying to tell you is that, from the Arab point of view, why don't the Americans get it? The Europeans get it. How come the Americans don't get it? And so here you have it. Now, this, by the way, is not true. Why do I say it's not true? Just as a reality check, the countries in Africa and Asia taken over by the European imperialists and colonialists in the 1800s and early 1900s were not virtuous, they were weak. You hear what I just said? These countries in Africa and Asia that were taken over by the British, the French, the Belgians, and all the others, they were not virtuous. They were technologically weak. Had they been stronger, they would be the imperialists. It's not that these countries were committed to a Gandhi situation in which there's nonviolence and love for all. It's just that, take the Arabs, for example, the North African countries that were colonized by the French, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and then Libya by the Italians. What happened over there? They were raiding the Europeans for centuries as the Barbary pirates, okay? If they could, they would conquer Spain again. If they could, they would conquer Italy again. They're not virtuous, they were just weak. And so eventually the Europeans caused it a technological gap that developed in the 1800s particularly, were able to take over these countries. But it's not that one's good and one's bad. But in the colonial discourse, one is good and one is bad, okay? There were times, as you see over here, when the Europeans were enslaved by the Muslims, and did that make the Europeans the virtuous and the Muslims not? They won't say that. But in post-colonialist discourse, the European imperialism is the great sin, and the colonized victims are victims of a unique evil. That's the famous theory of Edward Said and people like that. They're all over the place. That is a lie. I just want to get this straight. This is a lie. But nevertheless, I could get kicked out of my job for saying that. You understand? In other words, this becomes the political correct point of view. And it's like saying the poor are good. The poor are not virtuous, they're poor. Some are good and some are bad. Same thing with the rich. They're not virtuous, some are good and some are bad. One has more power than the other because they have the money. It's not that one is better than the other. The romanticism that's entered into the Western discourse since the early 1800s, late 1700s, is interesting, but it's not a reflection of reality. So if you go into a poor neighborhood, your chances are you get killed. You understand? It's not a virtue, although you can have novels and movies about virtuous poor people. And there are virtuous poor people just like there are virtuous non-poor people. So whether or not this makes sense, the Europeans, already flummoxed intellectually by Marxist ideas ever since 1900 or so, they fall for the new ideas of what they call the post-colonialist discourse. Since Israel has settlers, it's a colonialist. And therefore it's Nazi. It's essentially Nazi. Okay? You get what I'm saying? Obviously they understand the difference between the Nazi and the Zionists, but the difference is not important. What is significant is the commonality. That's what I want to be clear. Okay? Now, I see funny faces over here. I'm just laughing because this is so pushit. It's ridiculous, but this is the way the thought has gone. Now, these ideas that I just outlined with you, which are picked up by European intellectuals, do clash with guilt over the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, European coming to terms for the first time with the reality of the Holocaust also happens in the 70s. So you have this very interesting clash of dynamics. On the one hand, movies, novels, plays are starting to come out in Europe. What did my parents do during the war? What actually happened in Auschwitz and places like that? And on the other hand, you have the colonialist Israeli settler model. So what is Britain to do? What is France to do? What is Germany to do? What is Italy to do? So it's kind of funny. I'll say again, Europe starts to confront its past, but the Holocaust in the 70s. It's true of America too. Agreed? In this country, in the 50s, 60s, you didn't talk too much about the Shoah. The 70s started to come big in the movies and the play. The United States Holocaust Museum was in the mid-70s. It's interesting. It's what we call the reception and memory of events. So let's put it this way. The Holocaust remembrance now becomes part of official Western European culture. The Europeans cannot help be aware of the large survivor population in the state of Israel. A lot of these movies and plays and novels are about that. They'll see the good Israel and the bad Israel from now on, right? There are many European movies like that. The good Israel will be this kibbutz of German Jews who ran away in the 30s and are nice, liberal people, but then out there you have the bad Jews that are operating the Israeli military-industrial complex and things of this nature. So this is an existential clash of ideas which puts European thought in a permanent tension when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's what it is. The Europeans can't help thinking, why can't Israel resolve our cultural tensions by agreeing to a Palestinian state, which is very European, self-centered psychoegoismo. The second negative factor in the development of Israeli-European relations, which I think is the last thing I'll be speaking about tonight, was the demographic results of this confused amalgam of leftist and post-colonialist discourse with a healthy dose of postmodernist deconstruction thrown in. You don't know anything except those that do about literary deconstruction, which is Dominique Foucault and what's his name, Derrida. Derrida, Jewish, by the way, from Algeria. One of the Jewish pied noirs. This is all part of movements that most people outside the narrow confines of university, especially linguistics and literature departments, aren't aware of. They have a powerful impact on public thinking of elites, and you can deconstruct meaning. A sentence is a discourse, doesn't actually have meaning. It's the power relationships reflected in the interpretive strategies that allow people to draw different types of meaning out of there. So basically, the Holocaust can be deconstructed in 1,000 ways. That's not what Derrida was into, but that's what emerges out of it. And the conclusion out of all this business is the colonized peoples are virtuous, and it would be therefore racist to deny them immigration in large numbers into the European countries starting in the mid-'70s. Okay? Now you all know what happens after that. You end up with the Europe of today. There are, by the way, also economic reasons for bringing in a large third world workforce. The Europeans after the war, embracing all the ideas that I just described to you, therefore have a kind of very materialistic, as opposed to a religious or idealistic, a very materialistic worldview. So that's not one that encourages people to get married and have large families. Bottom line, everybody in Western Europe is having 1 or 2 kids, which is unsustainable. And on the other hand, you also have Bernie Sanders. Is a free education, is a free health, is a free, who's paying for it? You understand? So you say, you pay high taxes. How many people are paying the taxes? The population is going to shrink. So therefore, you need bring in large people who are paid less, who work in the workforce, in the industries, and take the jobs that others don't want to take in Europe, and they will be kicking money into their work and their taxes. They'll be kicking money into the revenue system to support the social welfare program for the others. Okay, I get that, and so do you. What's the consequences of that? Okay, that they don't want to think about. That's very European. In Europe, you don't think about tomorrow. You just think about that. That's extremely characteristic of European history. You ally with this country today, and later on you ally with the opposite country tomorrow, and then the next day you do it. That's the story of Europe. That's why they always had wars until Truman. I mean, they've always had wars. So Europe, we want to support my lifestyle now. You understand? I got another 10, 15 years, the guy figures. Après-moi le déluge. Remember Louis XV said that? So, that's, in the 20th century is gone, and now by 2050 I'll be gone, and that's they think, and therefore let it go like that. Okay, I get that, but there are consequences, obviously, to that. And so the stage is set, as we all know, for a Muslim takeover by Europe by demography. By demography. If you think I'm exaggerating, go and line yourself and do the numbers. It's not that hard. This will have a structurally deleterious effect on Europe's reaction to the Arab-Israeli conflict, as we know. Remember the giant demonstrations that were in Paris when they had the Gaza war a couple years ago? All of a sudden, Paris is not the Paris of the 1950s and 60s. Nor is Berlin, nor is London, nor is any of these places. You have large amount of Muslims who defend their side of the argument the way the Jews do, except that they do it a lot more powerfully, and there's a lot more of them, and they're a lot more violent. Okay? This is a reality. If you're the Prime Minister of France, or of Britain, or one of these things, or Holland, you've got to take this into account. You can't actually have an overly friendly policy to Israel, or to be held to pay. That's just a reality of it. This all began in mid-1970s, the period I'm talking about, right after the Yom Kippur War. The big immigration starts 73, 74, 75, 76. Today, 40 years later, the Western Europeans can see that they made a big mistake, probably fatal, but they do not know what to do about it. Angela Merkel's like the poster baby for this. She's a wonderful person. She really is. If you follow her, she's a very fine person. And she's a very idealistic person in the best sense of social democracy. And she's not a social democrat. She's Christian Union. But nevertheless, she's a very good person, and she has a very good attitude towards Israel and things like that, absolutely. But her goodness and liberalism has put her into a bind. If there's 1 million refugees, as you know, last year from Syria, we've got to take them in. If there's another 1 million, we've got to take them in also. If there's another 1 million, you've got to take them in also. So you've got to see that you're shooting yourself, but you don't know what to do because you can't change your whole worldview. One day people will write histories of this, if there's any of us left, of what happened to Europe in the early 21st century. And it'll be a very, very interesting story, I fear, for the last chapter. Notice I've been referring tonight to Western Europe as I come to the end of my remarks. They are the countries with the fatal combination of these krum cultural hashkafas and suicidal Islamic immigration policies. These countries are going under and do not see a way out. Now, by contrast, the Central European countries and the Eastern European countries have quite a different history, right? They're under Russia. They have no history of colonialism in the Third World whatsoever. When did Poland have colonies? When did Lithuania have colonies? You understand? And so they have a history of being colonized by the Muslims. There's a movie from Poland that was made under the communists. It's very famous about Colonel Władysławski, or whatever his name is, the famous trilogy by Sienkiewicz, Fire and Sword, Pan Władysławski, and the third one is the Potop, is the Deluge. Very interesting. It's just like the Gone with the Wind of Poland. The guy who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1906, okay? And what do you see over here? The Turks and the Tartars are coming in, and they're enslaving and terrorizing and killing the Christians, meaning they did it to Poland. You understand? Poland has no guilt trip whatsoever vis-a-vis the Muslims. They have the opposite over there. They say, you guys should have a guilt trip vis-a-vis us, and of course they do not. And consequently, that's why you read in the, look what this guy's going to, whatever. He says, that's why you read that Poland says, we're not taking any refugees. We're throwing them out of the country. We don't care if the European Union falls apart. We don't care if we get fined. This is that it. Same thing with Lithuania. Same thing with the Ukraine. Same thing with all these countries. We know who the Tatars are. We know who the Muslims are. They used to come in and carry the women off for the slave markets. They used to come in and cut the throats of all the men, like you see in these historical dramatizations. And by the way, they're not interested in any Marxist analysis whatsoever. They went under the communists. They don't want to hear post-colonialist junk. They don't want to hear the deconstruction. Anything associated with Marxism is trafe. In Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, forget it, baby. These new countries have a very different attitude towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a weird attitude also. Let's go to the next one. And it's an attitude that combines an anti-Semitic history of the Holocaust with a pro-Israel foreign policy. That's why you can get a crazy country like Hungary. This is Bibi in Budapest, okay? If you know who the Hungarian government is now, Orban, these are the guys who are the extreme right. And they're rewriting the history books to say, we didn't kill the Jews, and anyway, they deserved it, like that. And these guys who are famous Nazis are really national heroes and so forth. They don't like the past that's been handed to them by the West, okay? And yet, at the same time, it's very interesting. They're very good terms with Israel. They sign a lot of mutual beneficiary terms with Israel. These are like fascist, semi-fascist states. But Bibi's got to go there because it's the world. You got to play with the players. You understand? And so today, Western European countries, governments, I should say, are culturally committed to a two-state solution, and they fit very nicely with Obama and Kerry. President Obama and Secretary Kerry were in their foreign policy orientation Western European. Okay, you can those who like it. I'm not making jokes over here. Those who like it. Those who don't like it. But that's who they were in their foreign policy. The Western Europeans do not know what to do with Donald Trump. Obviously, they don't understand this at all. Okay, they don't know what to do with it. As you know, the latest news is that Abbas, the head of the PLO, is calling for the Europeans, meaning the Western Europeans, to take over the American role in brokering a peace. Is Bibi interested in that? On the other hand, let me leave you tonight with the following sober thoughts. The left-wing parties in the Knesset, the Zionists using the leftover social party, would be interested in a European brokered two-state solution. Understand this? So your one election, you can have your own opinion, whatever you want. But what I just described tonight could be very much on the front pages of discussion tomorrow or the day after when the next Israeli elections happen, which is not so far down the road. I know this is all very confusing tonight and the hour is late, so I'll just say good night.